Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Ben-Zvi Yulin. I'm the director for SCMA. Welcome to this evening's webinar, Behind Closed Doors, the Secret Powers of Mediators, brought to you by the SCMA Attorney Outreach Committee. I want to remind everybody that this event is in meeting format, and since we have over 200 people registered for this event, we ask that you please stay muted throughout the presentation. This webinar is also eligible for 1 hour of MCLE credit and 1 hour MC3 continuing education credit. If you are requiring MCLE credit for attending this event, we ask that you please check in by putting your state bar number in the chat. We also have handouts in support of this webinar, which you should have received yesterday. But in case you missed it, we'll go ahead and put it in the chat later as well. Before I pass it over to our moderator, I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to our webinar sponsors, ADR Services, Inc. and AIM Institute. At this time, I want to share a short video that we received from ADR Services.
ADR Services, Inc. has been your unwavering partner in alternative dispute resolution. But as the world changed, so did we. From virtual and hybrid hearings to our ongoing on-demand CLE program, to the recruitment of the most skilled and diverse neutrals across the state, ADR Services, Inc. continues to keep resolution and legal education at the forefront and ensures that every client has a voice that fits their needs. And with our AMS case management system, our neutrals, clients, and staff can facilitate communication and access their case's information anytime, anywhere. That way, they can stay focused on what matters most. You, woman owned and operated from the start. There is someone for every situation. We are ADR Services, Inc.
Okay, thank you again to ADR Services for supporting SCMA. Also sponsoring the event is the AIM Institute. Lee J, do you want to mention something about that? Oh, you're muted.
And I was doing so well, too. So our tagline is world-class training for the complete mediator. We have a whole host of training workshops and webinars and all sorts of things pre-recorded online for download. We're about ready to kick in and start doing some live courses again soon. It's the American Institute of Mediation.com, and hope that you enjoy what we've put out there, because our goal is to help make mediators better everywhere.
Thank you so much, Lee J. Okay, I guess at this time we could go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce Craig Lang, who is our moderator for today's presentation.
Well, thank you, Bouvier, and thank you everybody for attending today. I am Craig Lang. I'm co-chair of the SCMA Attorney Outreach Committee. One purpose of our committee is to educate attorneys about the mediation process and to give them advice on how to get the most out of it. I definitely think that is something we're going to accomplish today with this great panel we have. Another great things about events like this is that the audience is a good mix of practicing attorneys and practicing mediators. Our panel is going to give a lot of insight about what happens when mediations, get tough, or when things kind of have to go maybe in a different route than what we're mostly used to. When things require flexibility or pivoting, as I've mentioned before. And there's going to be a lot of good advice for young and upcoming mediators. But for the attorneys, I think, one, it's going to be a chance to get inside the mind of mediators and understand what happens when, say, maybe your client or the other party takes a tight position in mediation. But we also plan to bring it around by talking about what you guys as attorneys can do in situations where, say, just a typical mediation won't resolve the dispute. So without further ado, let me introduce the panel. Our first guest is a mediator with ADR Services, having mediated more than 3,000 cases with great success. He has been named a Distinguished Fellow by the International Academy of Mediators and a Power Mediator by Hollywood Reporter. He has co-authored the book Inside the Mind's Alternative Dispute Resolution, and was a writer for LA Law. So please welcome Daniel Ben-Zvi. And our second panelist is on the American Arbitration Association Master Mediator for Employment Matters. a panelist for a national panelist for its commercial and construction panels, and a select mediator on its International Center for Dispute Resolution. He is a distinguished fellow with the International Academy of Mediators, and one of only 5 mediators in the U.S. Certified by the International Mediation Institute. He is also the founder of the American Institute of Mediation. So please welcome Lee J. Berman. And one more thing before we begin, you guys have noticed that we may have the format of this seminar is one so that we can, if you so let us, see and hear you. That's because when we get to the questions, which are going to be at the end, you're going to have a chance to directly speak to the panelists. So if you think of any questions, don't put them in the chat because we've got the bar, everybody's bar numbers and all that stuff in there. So we won't see them, but you have the option of the reaction panel on the bottom of your Zoom menu to raise hand. And at the end, we're going to go through and I'm just going to have you guys ask your questions. You definitely, at least so we can hear you and hopefully see you as well. And we'll give the chance to, you'll have the chance to do that at the very end. So, let me get into it basically. And I'm going to pose my first question to Dan here. Dan, we talk about mediators being intuitive or counterintuitive. And can you explain what we mean by that?
Okay, first of all, pleasure to be here. Thank you, Craig, for inviting me, SCMA, thank you. And Lee J, it's an absolute pleasure to be on a panel with you, not just seeing you at the International Academy of Mediators, where we meet twice a year somewhere in the world. So 81 to 95, I was a trial lawyer. In 95, I became a mediator. And so I have witnessed the prediction of Janet Reno coming true, which is when she said ADR, alternative dispute resolution, should become appropriate dispute resolution, and the alternative is court. And of course, we know that is the state of affairs. And even though most parties may feel forced to mediation, most voluntarily settle. So let me give you some counterintuitive insights instead of just discussing what counterintuitive means. So this is what my counterintuitive insights are, that people may be compelled to mediate under statute, contract, or just the pressure of the court that the parties mediate before a trial, and some enter mediation thinking it may be a waste of time, but most of them change their attitude of mediation and settle their case, gaining the benefit of certainty, peace, and resolution. Counterintuitive insight. The more I emphasize to a side that they have control, not me, the more influence I have, the more they listen. I find it helpful to explain that mediation is like medication. If a doctor says you have a serious illness, you can take the risk of turning over control of your body to a third party called surgeon, or you can first take control over your body with diet, exercise, and medication. And only if that doesn't work do you turn your body over to that third party surgeon. So too with your dispute. You first take control over trying to resolve your dispute in mediation. If that does not end your dispute, only then do you turn your dispute over to a third party called judge, jury, or arbitrator. I find that analogy helpful to explain to people who have a problem still understanding what mediation is and the distinction between mediation and arbitration. Counterintuitive insight, paying attention. For those here who do volunteer mediations where parties don't pay for mediation and you have problems settling your cases, don't be disheartened. Cognitive dissonance, generally, I find it more difficult to mediate free voluntary cases. When the party pays, the party tends to listen more and be more invested in the process. Counterintuitive insight, being a devil's advocate. Arguing the other side's position is certainly key, but sometimes a party is more flexible when you're the supporter or angel's advocate rather than devil's advocate. Sometimes by giving voice and support to a party, that party will end up actually seeing and even defending certain positions of the opposition and arriving at a more compromised number on their own. I'll have a few more counterintuitive insights. The more I focus on a party's self-interest, the better. For example, early on, I'll ask a party, what's your goal? And sometimes I get to hear it's to punish that SOB. I ask that person, is that other party in the other room so important to you? When I ask your goal, your family's goal, you talk only about him? No, he says, I don't care anything about that SOB. I just want my fair share. That helps to pave the way forward. Counterintuitive insight. I often want to talk to an attorney privately near the start and periodically throughout the session without their client. I sometimes ask attorneys at the outset, what do they think the odds of settling today? Some say 10 or 5%, others say 60%. Counterintuitively, those who say 60% often tells me the case will be harder to settle. I might add, I try to speak to the attorney privately without his attorney consistently throughout the day, as I mentioned. I want to know the experience the attorney has had with the client, whether the attorney has client control or influence, and whether the attorney believes the client appreciates the risks. Counterintuitive insight. Better not to resume negotiations prior to mediation. The problem is that offers made before mediation may set the floor or ceiling, create unrealistic expectations. The mediator's expertise is to set expectations and guide the negotiations in ways to maximize the opportunity to reach agreement. I sometimes tell parties that I picture the two parties on a mountaintop cliff, aiming at each other, pointed fingers like guns at each other. I point out that when you do that, the three fingers are pointed back at themselves. And I question what that could mean. In other words, how can they be hurt in the litigation? I view my role as turning those people so that they are ultimately faced in the same direction, looking at the path down the mountain, both focused on how to solve the problem. Joint session counterintuitively can be very helpful in a way that has nothing to do with the opposition. I know there's a lot to discuss. I have an article on my website all about using joint sessions in so many various ways. But one counterintuitive example of using a joint session, and by the way, most of mediations do not have joint sessions in Los Angeles, but I'm probably a mediator that uses more joint sessions than most, but it's still the minority of times. But it is helpful sometimes for the client to see his own lawyer protecting and advocating his interests. That client may be more attentive to his lawyer after having witnessed his lawyer fighting her battle. This can also be done in caucus. So I think I just highlighted some examples of counterintuitive insights, but I'll stop there.
Well, I think those are great examples. And so my next question then just is to you, Lee J. Are you intuitive or counterintuitive?
That's a really great question, and I've actually given it a lot of thought. So I think we all begin intuitively, meaning we're rolling out and practicing what we learned in our training courses. So they say, well, you know what you do for one side, you always do for the other. And they give us kind of the rules and the guidelines and the guardrails, if you will, of neutrality and of being good mediators and self-determination and all of that. So I think we start intuitively because we're doing what we were taught. Then as we get more advanced, more confident, we've got, a bunch of notches in our belt, or we're feeling more comfortable in the saddle, as we say, I think then we start to get counterintuitive. And we say, I know we're not supposed to do this, but I'm going to do this here. Or I don't usually start this way, but today I'm going to start this way. And we start going against the grain and working from our own place that's different from the teaching and the training that we've had at times to say, I'm going to mix it up a little bit today and I'm going to be counterintuitive. But the interesting thing for me is I have reverted back literally to intuitive in the sense that I go in with far less structure and almost no expectations when I walk into a room, to the point where when the people who have studied with me come and observe my mediations, they'll ask me like, well, where do you think this is going to go? Or what are you going to do next? And I'm like, I have no idea, because I'm really being adaptive and I'm being very present and I'm in the moment. And I'm following truly the intuitive instinct where people give us hints of things verbally and non-verbally. And that's the place that I find I'm mediating from now. I'm meeting people where they're at, and I'm keying on the things that they're often not saying, but that you can just sense that needs to happen. And this sometimes leads to mediating dangerously, to quote Ken Cloak, all of our mentor. And it sometimes leads to us doing things that that are risky. And we're going to talk about some of those today as we go through all of this. Thanks, Craig. And by the way, great to be here with Dan. Great to be here with you. Thanks to you and Bouvier and Taisha for putting this all together. It's just a lot of fun to have so many folks together.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I agree. I do thank you guys for being here, and for everybody at SCMA, including those on my outreach committee who have helped in putting this together. So I wanted to get started with kind of getting that, that sort of introduction out of the way, to kind of give us some bearings here. I know that, I know every mediation is not the same. And I think, Lee J, you kind of touched on that. There are certain aspects that we can expect in mediation. And so just so we're all kind of on the same page here, do either of you have a concept of what may be I would say, quote, typical mediation or a traditional mediation? And Lee J, I'll start with you on that one.
Sure. I think a typical mediation in my mind is one where folks show up, and as much as we may ask in pre-mediation phone calls, we might try to intuit from the briefs and read between the lines. There are some cases that are just about money. And that's often the case where you have a commercial or institutional defendant, you've got an insurance adjuster, claims professional at the table, and it really is just about how much. And to me, that's more of what I would think of as a routine mediation, where as much as we might try to expand the pie and be creative and integrative, we end up really just having to find them a compromise where they don't want to collaborate, they don't want to do anything else. And it's our job to help them just land on that number. To me, that's a traditional bare bones kind of rock bottom typical mediation, I think.
Okay. And Dan, I mean, it's the same question to you, or do you have anything that you would add to that?
Well, I will add what we just said. As time passes, I see more cases before a lawsuit or arbitration is filed. That can be very helpful, particularly because defendants often see a benefit to there being no record of litigation. When do parties mediate if it is a litigated case? Well, most of the time it's best to mediate before the bulk of the work and expense of discovery and experts are undertaken, or before certain discovery, certain depositions, certain motions, like motions to certify class, like a motion to expunge a list pendants, a motion for summary adjudication or summary judgment. Almost all cases, briefs are submitted, confidential or shared, mostly confidential, sometimes both. Sometimes somebody will send me a confidential letter brief and share their other brief. That doesn't mean at certain times in the mediation that briefs are not shared at appropriate times. Preparation is key in every typical mediation. In almost every case, I create a one-page summary of parties and each witness, chronology of key events, and claim damages. And I always have it to my right over there, leaning, and I try to develop a nuanced understanding, appreciating that I am, as Judge Alec Williams says, a Johnny-come-lately to the dispute, which may have been going on for years before coming to that mediation day. I got a sense from the brief, typically, who I intend to speak to first. And usually it's the perceived weaker party, generally. Throughout the mediation session in different ways, with each side, I do a case risk analysis in a way that's most effective for the case and the parties involved. And of course, we cover the law, the facts, precedent, credibility, depositions, production, motions, trial witnesses, appeals, the delay in getting to resolution in court or arbitration, opportunity costs, effect on business, legal fees and expenses, stress, the approach to risk. The party might not share their attorney's appetite for risk. And of course, the odds of prevailing. Some attorneys at a certain point will be more candid with the range their clients are prepared to go. We can discuss reality versus negotiating strategy. And I always keep them separate when we talk. I said, now let's talk reality. Now let's talk negotiating strategy. I focus on issues that will move the negotiation along. And I make that very clear. I'm not sharing everything. And this is based on law, facts, and personalities, but it's just what will move the negotiation along. Typical cases, bargaining takes place, as Lee J discussed, and often we discuss terms, payment over time. Technique is important to know. And but we're going to discuss a little more beyond technique. But it's Lee J and I discover how strange it is that places like, because I mentioned joint sessions are not popular in Los Angeles in the typical mediation, but in Nashville and Montreal, almost all mediations have joint sessions. Now that's interesting to analyze, but it is a fact. Most of my cases are done via caucus shuttle diplomacy, where I go from room to room with an exchange numbers or offers. Joint sessions at times will be helpful. Again, I refer you to my articles on my website about joint sessions. But again, it's in the minority of cases. And then there's what everybody knows, joint session bracketing, mediators' proposals, risk analysis. And last thing I'll say is in the typical case, multiple plaintiffs, where there are multiple plaintiffs, I always seek to figure out an allocation between the plaintiffs as the first order of business.
And that's really interesting. And so then my next question to you, Dan, is so, and we're obviously gonna get into the more detail of this, but maybe if you can kind of give some examples of what are some situations where a change or pivot to, I guess, either your usual or traditional approach to mediation might occur.
Okay. First of all, many of you out there probably remember the Riskin grid, which is which he was misunderstood as saying either you're an evaluative mediator or a facilitative mediator. What he meant to say was that you need to be whatever is called for in that particular situation. As far as pivoting, that's where the rubber meets the road. I love Thomas Edison's quote, "Our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to succeed is always to try just one more time." And he also said, when you have exhausted all possibilities, remember this, you haven't. Each mediator needs to find their uniqueness and how to pivot beyond technique. It's what works for you. For example, some may be able to use humor, others may not. Humor is often a release of emotion. What's the difference between a mediator and an ice skater? A mediator is always skating on thin ice. I can share my gestalt, my attitude in pivoting, but I've learned that you need to find your own authentic approach. As one wise person said, if you're busy being someone else, who will be you? And as Yogi Berra said, half the game is 90% mental. Mediation is a dance with rhythm and timing. Sometimes you strongly lead. Sometimes you allow the other freedom to dance on their own. But most of the time, you can't skip the dance. Like the expression says, it takes 9 months to have a baby, no matter how many people you put on the job. The right number at the wrong time is the wrong number. A good mediator coaches the pace of negotiating and presenting of arguments and evidence. Timing of concessions can be key. Smoking gun and other favorable pieces of evidence are sometimes most effective, if not disclosed all at once, but rather piecemeal to move the negotiation along. Negotiation, like soup, it boils over if you turn it on too fast. Simmering works. But let me explain my gestalt in how I view the parties and mediation when it's time for me to pivot. So this is inside my head. So first of all, I see a big metaphorical screen whenever a bigger picture is needed. So I use telescope or microscope. And by that, I mean, let me use an example of depression. Okay, so I see a big screen with lots of dark clouds. So my task is to zoom out. And as I'm zooming out, suddenly I'm seeing blue sky. The dark clouds are still there, but as I zoom out further, I'm seeing mountains, trees, I'm seeing homes, a whole world out there. The clouds are still there, but the clouds, the dark clouds, are not inappropriately overwhelming. Now, we could be dealing with anger or any issue that needs a bigger perspective, a real context. So that's the image I have. And I totally rely on Aristotle's methods of persuasion, which he created in 350 BCE. I have never heard anything better than it. Logos, logic; ethos, credibility; pathos, passion, emotion. So logos, logic, does it make sense? A lot of times I'll say to the party, looking back, when you're sitting there awaiting the verdict, sitting next to your attorney after a week of trial, don't you think you want to look back and say to yourself that back, whether it was 2 years prior at mediation, you exhausted the mediation opportunity, and that's why you're taking this risk? That's logical. Risk analysis, law, facts, realities, logic. Ethos, credibility. That means, why should a mediator's opinion be respected? It's the mediator's resume or the mediator's experience, and the mediator needs to share that, needs to get the parties and the attorneys confident in the mediator's guidance. And even my failures as a trial lawyer is very helpful. Where one is seared in my memory, where I won the case but lost, but had a very low damages award. Pathos, passion, emotion. Does it evoke feelings, empathy, fear, caring? Who was it? Maya Angelou, who said that people may not remember what you said, but they'll remember how they made you feel. So will a jury be moved? And it's also the appetite that the person has to overcome the fear of proceeding with a trial. So then I approach each person as broken up into 4 sections, 4 paradigms, let's say. And I determine that on how, but I figured those paradigms to be how I persuade parties. The sage, the warrior, the prophet, the lover. The sage, the logic, the objectivity of a party. The warrior, being the fighter, the appetite to fight, knowing how to fight. The prophet as in PHET, seeing the future, being able to really see the future realistically. And the lover, the feeling. So when getting a verdict, when talking about potentially getting a verdict and losing, the prophet can see that, but the lover can feel it. And it's like a body's homeostasis. There's a balance, a stability at every moment in each one of us is, temperature, blood pressure, everything is creating balance. So what I'm looking at somebody and I'm seeing which one of those are the strong parts and which one of them are weak that needs to be built up. And the key to all that is figuring it out by being sensitive to communication, to understand the person. And by that, I just simply mean appreciating that body language is the most important thing. And that's a benefit of Zoom because we see eye rolls more prominently on the screen. The tone of the person, even more so than words. Listen to this example. I didn't say he took the money. I didn't. Each time I'm going to say this, it means something totally different. I didn't say he took the money. 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 So that's just a classic example. And then finally, the words. So all this is what goes on in my head when I am figuring out intuitive message and determining how I pivot.
That's excellent. And so Lee J, I'm gonna pose the same question to you. Are there situations where you see that you might require a change or a pivot from your usual approach or from, say, a traditional approach?
Thanks, Craig. First, I would love more than anything in the world to live just for a day in Ben-Zvi's head.
No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't.
Just to see the visions he's describing to us and everything else, that would be a wild ride. And by the way, anybody who's interested in the 4 archetypes that Dan's talking about, one of the best books out there about it is Winning from Within by Erica Fox. I highly recommend it. Winning from Within. I don't look for signs to pivot during a mediation unless I have an aha moment that I missed something, in which case I've pivoted plenty. I tend to think about changing it up. You know, the old expression about, you got to think outside of the box. Those of you who know me know, I say destroy the damn box, trample on it, shred it, and toss it out, and then start. And that's what I do. So I was on a plane to Greenville, South Carolina, going through Atlanta the other day with all the storms and everything else, and flying in to do a mediation, pardon me, and scratching my head about how I was going to begin this particular mediation. And it came to me on the flight, the intuition we were talking about earlier. I just decided I was going to start completely differently than I have before. And it worked. So a couple of examples of these. One of them was I worked with a rock band that came to me on the verge of breaking up. They were about to be all suing each other. Nobody had they had no partnership agreement in 15 years. Nobody had any idea who owned the logo or the name or any of those sorts of things. And it was about to be a hornet's nest as the 4 of them were about to go 4 different directions. So the business manager actually called me and said, we've got the band's lawyer on board. We want to send all 4 of them to you. You fix this. So it's weird having a bit of an agenda as a mediator because they kind of asked me to keep together the goose that lays the golden egg. But I'm thinking about how do you start with 4 people who all have their lawyers, almost like a family mediation. They have their lawyers on the outside for consulting, but just the 4 guys showed up for the day of the mediation. And I thought about it and decided I'm going to do something totally different. I'd already had hour-long phone calls with each of them before they walked in the room. I'm a big front loader. I want to know everyone's perspectives before they walk in the room. So that was already 4 hours invested, but boy, I knew every person's gripes. You talk to them for an hour. In the last 15 minutes, you learn what's really going on. And so I talked to all 4 of them. We come together and I started by saying to them, on any given day, some given Tuesday in the middle of September, 3 of them had small kids. I said, on any given day, you come together to do this band thing rather than going to the beach with your kids that day or going and sitting on an island drinking a margarita somewhere. What is it about doing the band thing that feeds you, that gets you out of bed to go do that each day? And they all took a couple of moments and wrote down their answers, and I gave them plenty of time. And I said, okay, if you had to pick the one that's most important, share it with the group. First guy says, he's a guitar player. I love coming down stage and watching the fans, hands in the air. I just love rocking the whole arena. And I want to do that every chance I can do. I would do it every day if we could. So great. Next. And the next guy goes and he says, I love our music. I think I love our music. and I want to play our music and I want to write more of it. And I want to play our thing because I think our music is unique and it's different. And that's what does it for me. I don't care if we're in the studio rehearsing or if we're in front of a crowd. It's playing our music that I love. I said, fantastic. Third guy goes, he's the drummer. He says, I think we have a chance to be one of the great rock and roll bands of all time, with the Beatles and the Stones and Zeppelin and you name it. And I think it would be a crying shame if we split up before we had a chance to see if we could be. And everybody kind of went, wow, that's a high bar. Good for you. Went to the last guy and he said, money. And everybody laughed and rolled their eyes. He said, no, seriously, in 10 years, I expect I'm going to put on weight, I'm going to be bald, and nobody's going to want to see me fronting a rock band. I've got 10 years to put aside all the money I can to put my kids through college, to secure their education, to put the kind of roof over my wife's head that I promised her I would. And that's what these next 10 years mean to me. And that's what I'm here for, guys. This is a business. And so we went, wow. But had to help them understand that in order for them to stay together as a band and for this thing called the band to work, they each had to get out of it what each of them needed in order to feed their souls and come do this. So this guy had to tour so he can play up, on stage and watch the hands go crazy in the audience. This guy wants to make more and more music and not break up. This guy wants to be one of the great bands of all time. And they're still becoming that today because they're still together. And they left me, and after the restructured agreement we made for them that incentivized everybody to do everything that all of the other band members needed in order for them to be happy, they made 4 times the income the year after they were with me than they did the year before. And they've since come back 2 more times to rejigger their agreement and work out their kinks and all that sort of stuff, because now they become mindful about it and conscious about it. And you talk about like the book, The Promise of Mediation, they are learning and teaching others. And now they have their own little meetings together and all that sort of thing. One more similar quick story. I was working with the symphony orchestra who was about to launch into huge litigation with their board. There was already a claim from the music director, who was also the conductor, who was in between the board and the orchestra. So long story short, the board was 10 people. I had the orchestra of 80 some people elect 10. And I told them I want 10 with diverse opinions about what should happen here today. I don't want 10 who are all aligned. I want 10 that represent all of the thoughts that the orchestra has. We had this humongous, gorgeous conference table that seated 20 some in the round, like a King Arthur table. And I had them sit board member, orchestra member, board member, orchestra member, all the way around the table. And then instead of good morning, who would like to make an opening statement and all that sort of thing? Again, no lawyers this day were in the room. So I had a little bit more leeway, and it tended to be non-traditional. But I said, here's what I want to know. I want to know your name. I want to know your day job. I want to know what the first instrument was that you picked up and played. And I want to know the name of your first band teacher in elementary school or whenever that was, who instilled in you the love you have of music today. 20 people went around that table and started getting tears in their eyes. And I'm a banker, but I started playing clarinet and, blah, 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 blah. And then it came around to me. And I said, I started on piano. I learned to play saxophone. Diane Daler in 4th grade was the music teacher that got me hooked. And I'm envious of all of you because you all get to come together and create something where you're making music. So this is, to Dan's point, this is the lever, right? You're making music together as an 80-something piece orchestra. And even as the board, you're putting this out there for the community. And this symphony orchestra was loved by their community. It was a centerpiece and a piece of pride for the community. They were about to disband and go away over a dispute with the music director. But by the time we finished these introductions, and I said to them, look, I play my saxophone today. I walk around my empty house and I play to music that I put on the speakers. You all get to come together and play music like I used to in junior high and high school and college. And if we can't work this out here today, you're not going to have that opportunity here anymore. the place where you do this is going to go away. So it's beholden on all of us to make this work and to figure out what we're going to do to make this better. And by lunchtime, they were breaking off in groups of, 2 board members and 3 orchestra members over here all talking and so on. And the entire dynamic changed. So Craig, when you asked me about pivoting, I pivot at the starting gate. You think about the Kentucky Derby with 10 horses all lined up. I'd find a way to reinvent that and make it something completely counterintuitive and make it so that it works for the people that are in front of me. And I'm lucky that on both of these days, it worked. And I don't know that it would have if I'd sat down and, looked for opening statements from each side and what are your demands and, all those sorts of things. I think it would have blown up in a half a day in both cases. So it's the courage to be innovative and creative that I think makes us unique and makes this thing mediation that we do have value that's demonstrated to the lawyers. And some of you have heard me say this before. I think if we keep shuttling numbers back and forth, a friend of mine, Rob Dimitrievich, who was a mediator up in San Luis Obispo, maybe still is, used to call it pushing insurance money back and forth across the table. If all we're doing is running numbers from room to room and we're not doing anything more special and more creative and more bold than that, then I'm afraid we're going to lose this thing called mediation because soon they won't need us. In fact, they're inventing apps as we speak that will do all of that for them. So that's my pivot, Craig. It's from hello.
Well, that's a really good point, and I think I kind of liken it to, you could use a sports analogy. And any team that's gone and studied the tapes of the team they're about to play, well, they might have their set moves, but hey, now we've seen what this guy can do. Now it's similar to them talking to the person. You talking to the person in advance and getting to know them. Say, now we've seen how this person moves. Let's adjust our plays. And everything you might have learned in practice up till then, and that doesn't completely go out the window, but certainly you've got to make adjustments and things like that. So I think that's sort of what I think of when you talk about that, but that's, you do it from the very beginning. And that kind of goes into my question, which you kind of answered, but Dan, I'm going to turn it to you. So, talking about times before the mediation begins, can you think of some times maybe where you've seen signs that that you are going to have to, take a certain approach and exactly, what have you done?
All right, before I answer that,
Sure.
based on what Lee J's story just was, beautiful story.
Mm-hmm.
Lee J, for your birthday, I'm going to write a song. Lee J uses all leeway. But that was a great story. And you're right. That's we've got to, as Ken Cloak, who you already mentioned, wrote in his book, Mediating Dangerously, or that says it all. So, Craig, at the beginning of a case, if I see there's a history between parties, that's different than a traffic accident or personal injury, or where there's a history of a relationship between a plaintiff and defendant, be it employment, partnership, trust and estates, elder abuse, business, ongoing business dispute. There are often underlying issues of resentment that typically need to be aired and dealt with. At the very least, venting, letting air out of the balloon can be key and helpful to do early in the process. Like a long-term employee who needed to cry about how awful it felt to get fired after 10 years, believing it was unfair due to his age. But what came out to be most distressful to him was how the boss insulted the plaintiff's wife. That needed to be vented, and the boss's apology then helped settle the case. Viktor Frankl, the known psychiatrist, was on a phone call with a friend on the verge of suicide. He was trying to give him every reason to live. When that person did not commit suicide, Frankl asked him which argument persuaded him. And the answer was none. It was just that he listened. He felt heard. Sometimes the best is to go with the flow, of aggressive advocacy. What do I mean by that? Near the end of the day, an attorney for a defendant says to me with a loud voice, "I won't let my client pay 1 more cent." I look at the client and I tell her what a strong, wonderful advocate she has and how he'll be the same in the courtroom. But if she, the client, is sitting in the court next to her attorney and the verdict comes for the plaintiff for a shockingly large sum, she wouldn't, because of that verdict, have a malpractice claim against the attorney. Right? I asked the attorney. That's right. She would not be able to sue me for malpractice, nor could she even blame the attorney because he did the best he could. Right? I asked the attorney. Yep, that's right. Well, that's the risk we've been talking about avoiding for the past hours. So now that got us back to discussing the risk factors and negotiating until settlement. I sometimes need to remind the parties of the definition of compromise. Giving up what they believe they are entitled to for other strong reasons, like avoiding risk of losing, ending the fight, getting certainty, and for a plaintiff, closing the win. I might ask a stuck defendant if they believe their last offer was fair. Do they feel the plaintiff deserves that kind of money, what they just offered? No. The defendant tells me the plaintiff does not deserve anything. So I remind the defendant that what the defendant did in making the prior offer was indeed wise. A smart compromise that made sense for certainty, avoiding risk, and avoiding further expense. That paved the way for the logic of some further compromise to end the dispute. When an impasse hits, it's helpful to discuss in more detail discovery, deposition, dates, expert depositions, document production, witness prep, all what helps make trial more realistic, less theoretical. And again, joint sessions are an example that could be useful for other reasons than arguing the case. We understand why it'd be for arguing the case, which I think sometimes is very helpful. And I have to persuade known, respected attorneys that they have what it takes to argue persuasively, depending on the audience, depending on the judge, the jury. And here the audience is just the other party. And I am one who believes that sometimes that's very useful. But as far as other purposes, like in one wrongful death case that occurred in a state mental hospital, we got together in a joint session to review pictures of the deceased and to discuss the hospital's new efforts to limit risk of patient-to-patient attacks. Another favorite example of mine that Lee J triggered is when I had a band fighting over royalties. I persuaded them at night when we were at a logjam. I can't believe I persuaded them, but I did, to get together just to sing a cappella, which is one of their specialties, of one of their favorite songs. That did wonders to reach a settlement. Sometimes we can discuss in litigation cases potentially stipulating to arbitration, which then leads to positive and negative analysis of its cost, effect of no appeal, and other pros and cons. More often than not, that leads back to negotiation, making that real. And if heading to arbitration, if it is a case that that has already been stipulated or has an arbitration clause, then in an impasse, we can pivot and negotiate baseball arbitration. That sometimes works as a means to get back to negotiation. In one case, we negotiated around $600,000 top and $200,000 bottom. if there would be a baseball arbitration. What does that mean? It means if the arbitration is over 600,000, like a $2 million award, let's say, a runaway award, the defendant only has to pay 600,000. But if the award plaintiff gets is under 200,000, like zero, then the claimant gets 200,000. Now, this baseball arbitration negotiation jump-started, as it has in many cases that I've done, the negotiation right there and then by bridging the gap, which leads to settlement. More often than not, I make sure to share my reaction to what I see in the other caucus room, like what kind of witness plaintiff will make and the attorney's presentation overall. An employment case example, I told the defendant that I understand defendants to be sophisticated owners and managers who have had a wealth of business savvy. I then tell them, after talking to the plaintiff employee, I understand why they hired plaintiff and kept her as an employee so long. My conclusion is that for the same reason they hired the plaintiff and kept the plaintiff for so long as an employee is the same reason plaintiff appears credible to me and could be seen at trial as a good witness. Sometimes it also helps to convey to the defense the truth of how much plaintiff overall loved working at the employment at work. This is sometimes very disarming to the defendant. I find it helpful to discuss roles of attorneys and how they, by law, must argue the best law and facts for each side, and to let the client know that the attorneys can be switched. And these professionals would fulfill their professional role. It's now they know it intellectually, but when I say it, a light bulb goes off as to everybody's role. And I keep letting them know I am not just a neutral, I'm an advocate of resolution. That's my client, resolution. Reframing problems. I keep asking questions. I ask repeatedly about the problem. The key often is asking different questions. The one example I have of this is where deals with a tank, a new tank created by the Army. And a general had to deal with the new tank being too hot for those soldiers in the tank. And the officers were all trying to figure out the problem, which was framed as to how to make the tank cooler. How can we engineer the tank to be cooler? So they keep on coming up with these problems because they're asking it a certain way, until there's one officer who said, wait a second, maybe the problem is how to make the soldiers in the tank cooler. So instead of going to all the engineering experts, and the tank weighed way too much, so couldn't afford to have additional air conditioning and was over budget. So by asking how to make the soldiers cooler, they went to a doctor and it became a medical biological question. And they came up with a simple helmet. And that helmet had cold water going through coils in the head and the feet. And so that's just a perfect example for me of how reframing the problem you can't do it enough. Again, the joint session is a reality check as a taste for trial. If it's just going to be, sometimes it makes sense. By the way, I will never have a joint session. I will never do a bracket. I will never do a mediator's proposal unless everybody agrees. Most mediators will never do it without the consent of all the parties and attorneys, but it does help at times. Also, it's helpful for the client, again, like I mentioned before, to see their lawyer as a warrior and advocate. A known adjuster has told me that she needs to see or hear a plaintiff before paying a top dollar. Now, in that circumstance, an attorney who is told that, may change their mind about having their client present at a joint session so that adjuster can hear the plaintiff directly. And then can share the briefs, evidence at certain times. Last thing I'll say is that there needs to be an appreciation of pop culture. I most think about the CSI effect and how, so many judges share with me how, there's the patina of science is expected by juries since CSI became so popular. And there are many court potatoes out there. Judge Judy was earning $50 million a year, having written a book saying, don't pee on my leg and say it's raining. What does that mean? It means a Judge Judy fan often unconsciously thinks that their case will be meted out with justice like Judge Judy, clear, instant, uncomplicated, decisive. And so, we got to deal with that and distinguish, jury or judge who are not so black and white. Sometimes it's interesting to hear if somebody's like, what they appreciate, To Kill a Mockingbird or My Cousin Vinny. Then we deal with creative remedies like apologies. But I think the most important thing is that Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge. And that's key.
Yeah, and I think in you're talking about pop culture effect, and I think too that another thing is that nobody thinks of themselves as the villain. Everybody thinks of themselves as the hero of this story. So you've always got to keep that in mind, that you've got two people, two or more, however many parties you have. Everybody thinks they're the hero, so you've got to kind of take that into consideration. But I'm going to jump. I'm going to jump because we're running out of time here. This has been a great conversation. I want to get to questions, but I just want to kind of bring it back home for the attorneys that we have here. I know they're getting a lot of insight. I think hopefully helpful insight to them. But obviously they might not necessarily think some of these things actually apply to them because they're not conducting the mediation. So I'd like, and I'll start with you. I think it's important for them, especially if they're interested in settling the cases for their client and having that flexibility themselves. And so what advice do you have for the attorneys in approaching mediation, especially if it seems like, what they might consider a traditional mediation won't bring the case to resolution?
So those of us who've been doing it for a long time, and as I flip through the pages of this Zoom, I can see so many of us that have been at this for decades and former SCMA presidents and everything else. We've seen, I think we can all imagine, if we haven't seen it ourselves, that at CALA and the Southern California Defense Council and ABTL and all the organizations, it's clear to us they've had workshops that said, don't trust the mediators. And you're asking, Craig, what I would advise lawyers to do. It's engage us. Use us as coaches for negotiation. Use us to brainstorm creative ideas. I once did a workshop called 12 Ways to Make Your Mediator Work Harder for You. They don't work us hard enough. They don't ask for enough from us. They hide their conversations from us and they give us a number. I don't ever accept that. I want to know what's going on, what's behind the number, what does the number represent to you, why that number? I ask all those questions before I go from room to room, but my favorite are the ones who call me in. I was doing a lot of medical malpractice cases for a while, and this one defense lawyer would inevitably give me two numbers every time I came back in. Well, EJ, I'm thinking we could go to 195 or we could go to 210 this round. What are your thoughts? And he's asking me in front of his claims professional and maybe one of his associates. And I like that he wanted some feedback from me. He didn't always take my advice, but he learned to start. And we would have fun and we would laugh. And I would tell him why I thought this number over that number. And it was an engagement in a process where he understood that, 3 minds were better than 2, or probably whatever the equation was in his room that day. We have spent decades doing this. We've taken more workshops and courses than most attorneys will ever know. And I would say, squeeze the fruit, get from us what we have learned, what our experience tells us. Dan and I have both done about 3,000 mediations. We've seen everything and we can help. And I feel bad for the lawyers who put these big, gigantic walls up and think that they're doing themselves and their clients a favor. I look forward to an artfully written brief. We can all tell when the first year associate wrote the brief and the partner stamped his signature on it. I want a brief. I appreciate briefs that say to me, here's what's going on. Here are the claims for damages. Here's how we got those numbers and how we put them together. Here are the ones, frankly, in a confidential brief that we think will hold up well. Here are some that we understand are speculative that we know you're going to talk to us about. And I want them to go on to articulate, and I ask them to, in my instruction in writing the brief, whatever they can tell me about their client, the client's relationship with the other client, the client's relationship with them, anything they can tell me that will help me glean from it something that needs to be done that day that's different from just pushing money back and forth between the rooms. I haven't done what you might consider a typical mediation in a very long time, but it's because I'm working with artful lawyers these days who understand what has to happen, who have more of the good ideas than I do. That's for darn sure. And all I'm doing is brainstorming with them and being a sounding board a lot of times. So that's what I would ask from the attorneys if they really want to maximize their client's takeaway, economically, non-economically, and frankly, their satisfaction with their own counsel, is engage us, let us help you, let us walk side by side with you, and let us help you get what you came there to get. So that'd be my plea. Okay.
Well, Dan, I'll pose the same question to you. What would you say to attorneys what advice would you give to help them in a situation like this where maybe typical of traditional mediation probably won't bring the case to resolution, but they've got to have some, they got to help you, I guess, pivot, or how would you put that?
Well, I'll summarize Lee J's point with never give up and help me help you. I want the attorney to continue to fulfill their professional role of arguing the best law and facts for their client. The attorney should always talk to the mediator privately without the client. I try to always make that happen, try to do it early on. If the client is not appreciating risk, let the mediator know what the attorney believes would be best for the mediator to focus on with his client. Law, damages, delay, risk, stress of trial. Brainstorm with the mediator, who is a doctor of negotiation. Listen to the advice of the mediator who has been in the opposition's room as to what will most move the other side in terms of negotiation. The attorney can discuss reality as to the range where the client needs to end versus negotiating strategy, can analyze both. Trust the mediator's insights on how to get there. Let the mediator know if another person who has key influence on the party, like a spouse, that should be involved. And again, there are all kinds of joint sessions, like just the attorneys meeting. Sometimes that's very helpful. And it's also helpful to the client know that the attorney has met with the other attorney. But if the mediator is suggesting a certain type of joint session, the attorney should consider it rather than blanketly rejecting it. I had a mediation where I just had the founders of a high-tech company that were working together for 30 years meet just the two of them with me. And my best move that sealed the deal was knowing when to walk out of that room. I stayed with an eye shot to make sure nothing damaging would happen, but they worked it out. So the only question is on any process, whether it's joint session or anything, is if it would help. And if the mediator thinks so, let's just analyze it and then make the decision. So the mediation also has the power to preserve relationships. Sometimes a joint session can be magical. Like one example I have is a football player and an agent who settled a mediation after an awful public dispute. And years later, the attorney told me that his client, the football player, and the agent were back working together. And the football player tells him that the dispute he views is like broken ribs. They grow back tighter. And who should know better than a football player? Another case, a contractor apologized for publicly yelling at his sub when, in the mediation, he was particularly under pressure with a very sick wife at home. So the attorney should appreciate the benefits of a settlement that can also have wonderful, unpredictable ripple effects. I heard from a lawyer after a settlement that his client's 11-year-old son said he was so happy about his dad's settlement. Why? Because after the settlement, his dad stopped coming home and yelling at him and his mom. What is that settlement worth to that family, to that little boy? That's hard to quantify, but a real part of the wonderful effects of resolution.
Yes, and I do have we're going to go to questions, but before we do that, I did want to talk about Lee J. I think you wanted to make a comment about mediating dangerously in the mediation. I think that's a good point to raise. So talk a little bit about that for us.
Thanks, Craig. I think at least I haven't talked much yet about pivoting that you've asked us to talk about. I talked about how I pivot at the beginning and shake it up from the start and all of that. But sometimes there's something that happens in the mediation that tells you you've got to do something different. And I think we need to give that a little bit of service here. So there's one case I mediated, for example, and this is mediating dangerously, as dangerously as I can think of in my time. It was a dispute. It was a partnership dissolution and a dispute between an uncle and his niece and nephew. So his sister's kids, but his sister had passed away. So when his sister passed away, he took his very young kid, her very young kids, who were then like 12 and 13, into his food distribution business and taught him the family business, taught him the ropes, taught him a work ethic, taught him how the business worked, and helped them develop into the business. But by the time they came to me years later, each had the uncle and the niece and nephew had set up side businesses competing with the main business and were allegedly steering customers off away from the main business to each of their side businesses at a greed to get a bigger share and not have to split with each other and all that sort of thing. And it was about to get really ugly. There were, as we sat together, well, I won't go into the details here and now, but I sat with them and I could see that they'd forgotten why they came together in the first place. And I think that's always a powerful question in a partnership dissolution, in a family mediation, bringing people back to when they started. So with the permission of both attorneys, like Dan said earlier, I brought the uncle and the niece and nephew into a room by themselves. And I promised the attorneys, we're not going to talk settlement. We're not going to talk dollars. We're not going to talk the law. I need to do something between them that's personal and emotional. And the attorney said, hey, if you can fix this, you go right ahead. So I took him into a separate room and I sat there with him for a moment. And I said, I never met your mom, your sister. But I can imagine that if she were here right now, she would look at you, her brother, and she would thank you for bringing her kids into the business and teaching them business and making good, honest young adults out of them and raising them in a way that she couldn't, to be the smart, caring adults that sit here in front of us today. And I never met your mom, but I assume that if she were sitting here, she would tell you how proud she is of both of you and the lives that you built for yourselves without having a mother to help you. And sure, you learned a lot from your uncle, but you also stood up and pulled yourselves up by your bootstraps and learned the business and worked hard. Nobody's denied that. And all I can say is that if she were here in this room, I think she'd have so much gratitude for both of you, for all of you, and so much admiration. And we settled the case in 45 minutes. That's mediating dangerously to me, because I could see in that room intuitively, they'd lost their connection. And if we could just put that connection back together, you could see it in the body language, the eye contact, the things they said about each other. And I wouldn't recommend necessarily trying this at home all the time, but I want to plant the seed and encourage you to be a little bold. And it's not just around emotions. There's one more quick one where it was another partnership to solution. This was a company that brought in ethnic foods from Mexico and sold them to ethnic markets here in California. Long story short, they settled they spoke Spanish the entire time. My Spanish is manageable, but I couldn't really follow them. And they would write with a pen on a pad that I purposely put in the middle of the table for them and slide the pen and the pad over to the other one and slide it back. And these two had grown up in the business together as well. They arranged for an amount of money. And I said, looks like you all have figured this out. Congratulations. And he said, yes, we've come up with a good number. And they both nodded. But the money guy, the investor side, said, but I'm not paying him that much money. And the guy who was on the other side, who was the sweat equity guy who built the company, said, and I'm not taking just that. And I'm like, so what exactly is it that we agreed to? They said, well, that would be a fair number. Long story short, we figured out there was some leverage by asking them each what about the business was so important to them and all of that. There was some leverage in one of the main products they had, this particular soup, that they could flip overnight and double their profits. And they had an exclusive contract to import it. And the guy who was buying his partner out wanted access to that contract. And we literally wrote a settlement agreement where the guy who was keeping the company would deliver 6 shipping containers full of this soup over the next 18 months to his money partner, who would then pick up the phone and call one of the big markets who would take the whole container and double his money. So the partner who was supplying the soup was supplying it at only like $90,000 at his cost. The partner who received the soup, flipped it and doubled his money, basically was receiving $190,000 or something like that for his share of the partnership. So nobody paid and nobody got $150, but we used the $150 as a basis for how to value the soup at a midpoint. And that's how we came up with 6 containers and all of that. This is math and this is business. But my point is, it wouldn't have happened if we didn't ask the right questions, like, what about this company is so important to you? What is it that's the most valuable asset that you think makes the company valued where you're valuing it? And questions like that brought to the surface, I don't even cook. So for me to know like soup and supermarkets and values, I'm the last guy who should have been mediating this case. So this is a little bit of what Richard Chernick used to call Lee J's Dare to Be Great speech. If I could settle a case like that for soup, when I don't even eat soup and don't buy soup at the store, you can too, just by listening to what they're telling you is important to them and figuring out how to make a formula just by asking dumb questions, Columbo questions. So what about the soup is so important? How does that work for you? And what would you do if you had more of it? And, would it be good or bad for you if you gave him some of it? And, just like fumbling around, not knowing what I was doing, but just asking these questions. And we constructed a business settlement that actually leveraged the value they placed on this soup and allowed that to bridge the gap for them in a way that nothing else would have ever. Examples that are emotional and that are non-emotional and tangible, that only come from listening really deeply and really carefully and watching really carefully what's in front of us. So to me, I think that's the really truly intuitive part of the practice that comes with time and it comes with practice, that some of us have that intuition and that feel. And if you do, then use it, rely on it, because I think that's a big part of, the lawyers in both of those cases, like, had no idea where this was going to go. And neither did I, but we all landed safely and everybody was happy. And that was what mattered. And it came from that listening piece, from that tuning in and connecting with the people in the room to figure out what they really wanted.
I think that's a great point. I'm glad you mentioned that. And I think I would just to sort of bring it back around to the attorneys. I think you talked about the impact of the emotional purpose behind a dispute and things like that. And what I would say would be my advice to attorneys is to, one, talk to your client and find that out for yourself. And two, don't be afraid to share that at mediation. I mean, like we said, there's a lot, like Dan was talking about, you're going to have time where you're going to be alone with the mediator. And at least you give that insight to the mediator to help them understand, even if it's something they don't want to share with, say, the other party, it certainly helps in that situation. Dan, let me just turn it to you one last time, since Lee J got to talk about the issue of mediating dangerously in mediation. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that yourself?
Well, let me just finish with saying that if there's not a resolution at the end of the mediation, follow-up is key. And everyone knows that I follow up, and everybody has my cell phone, and all good mediators do that, fortunately. And I'm available nights and weekends to talk, again, as most good mediators do. And perhaps you can reach an agreement for certain discovery, depositions, or exchange of experts, or selection of a mutual forensic accountant before the next session, or as part of just ongoing telephone calls or Zoom exchanges. The key is that we continue to exhaust every single opportunity. And I know you know that, Craig. I've seen you as an attorney for so many years in your practice, and it's nice seeing you on this panel. I will say one final thing before we end. I noticed that, like, my light went out right before this, before we started this panel. I talked about body language, and very important. I think it's very important, which something I don't have right now, a good light on your face when you're in Zoom, because eyes express so much. So don't do what I'm doing here. Make sure the bulb, gets put back in, and make sure you're clearly seen on the screen, because we're living in Zoom land now, and that is critical. So I'm going to end with that.
Well, thank you guys both. I want to get to some questions. We unfortunately don't have too much time left, but I do see Tim Spence. I've seen your hand up, I think, for quite some time. Hopefully you want to ask a question. If you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
I don't have a question. I do have an observation that I'd like to share. Sure. Tonight, I've seen two completely different styles. And I'm not a mediator, although I do have a legal background. I'm a financial reporting consultant. And the reason I found this discussion and what drew me to this discussion was I often enter situations which, shall we say, are a little sideways. And I need skills. Sometimes the easiest thing for me to do is to write a financial statement in compliance with the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's the everything else that is difficult. And I want to thank the both of you. And also, Craig, your time and your questions, giving two different styles an opportunity to speak. And it allows me to think, and it allows me giving me the opportunity to open up my mind a bit and to figure out different approaches with different clients. With that, I can only say thank you, and I will mute myself and let the next question go.
Well, thank you, Tim. I certainly appreciate that. And I think it's, without tooting my horn here, but what I had hoped with having Dan and Lee J here was exactly what you pointed out. You've got two different styles, and there's numerous mediators with many different styles, all of them all of them really good. And, so, it's just nice to see that contrast, but you can be successful many different ways. You can reach resolution many different ways, even when it seems like you can't. Are there any other questions? If anybody has a question, please, you can do the raise your hand on the, if you see on mine, at least that you click on more and you hit reaction, there is a hand raise icon that you can do. Does anybody else have any questions? Brett, I see you there.
Hi, thank you both for all of your insights. That was wonderful. I have a question for Daniel. Daniel, you talked about venting a little bit and finding counterintuitively that was sort of productive for you in a lot of mediations. Are there ever instances where you think, hey, this person's story, as I read it in their briefs, is so traumatic that retelling that story and venting might re-traumatize them to the extent that it wouldn't be necessarily productive of anything like you would necessarily want it to be? So is there a way that you sort of view that? And if so, how do you make that call up front when you presumably would have to make that call?
So that's a question I'm consistently asking myself from moment one of the mediation. It's like I'm trying to evaluate, for my paradigms and from the body language and from tapping the attorney. I will, in the private discussion with the attorney at the outset, I will try to get a sense of the emotional stability of the client, or instability. And I'm very mindful of that. And, if it doesn't have to be a joint session, it can be in my discussion, with the party that, it's a critical question. It's always one question: what will help this mediation? Traumatizing an individual will not help. It's a key issue.
Go ahead.
If I can just toss in on the tail end of that, one of the things that I make sure to do in my introduction at the start of every mediation is, when I'm contrasting the mediation process to the litigation process, one of the things I emphasize is that litigation is a forensic process. What was done, what was written, what was said, what was intended, what the damages are, who's culpable, and it looks backwards with hindsight at a problem. And I tell them, by contrast, today, we're going to look at the present and the future tense, and we're going to stay very future focused. So I ask them to give me permission, if we get too stuck in the past, to allow me to bring us back into the present, to focus on what we're here to do today. And so that's one of the things that I do. If I see somebody's getting in too deep and getting wound up and seeming to relive it again, I'll gently lift them out and say, always summarize before asking the next question, right? It sounds to me like this has been really, really, I think I understand this and this and this and this about what you're telling me. Let me ask you this though, given all of that, what do you want your life to look like a year from now and 5 years from now? Talk to me about that. And I'll shift their emotion into a different vision, because they're in that vision sort of state as they're telling you all this. They're reliving a time in the past. So that's one of the things I do. And one other small one is with big grief cases, like med-mal cases, a wrongful death or something. I'll tell them, if this is the whole of all the grief and the pain you're feeling right now, and I'm rushing this because I know we're short on time, maybe this half is the part that we can deal with today. This half is the business side of the equation that we need to get resolved, so that you can put this aside, so that you can start to focus on this half, which is really dealing with your grief and rebuilding your life and moving forward and knowing that your kids will be taken care of, or whatever their situation is. So this is all of what you're feeling today, but truly this is the only half that we can help you with today. But it's in service of helping you get this half resolved after today. And so that's how I bifurcate the emotion from the business part of it that people have to be thinking about, and that we need them to be propped up enough and emotionally stable enough that they can make business decisions about how they want to resolve that piece of litigation if the time is right.
Sorry about that. Thank you. And Charisse, I see your hand is up.
Yes, hi, thank you. Okay, I'm interested in reading Mr. Zvi's book. Can you tell me where I can find it?
Sorry, which book was that?
Dan's?
Inside the Minds
Oh.
of the Mediator.
Oh, Dan.
Just
Yes.
send, you know what? Go to my website, send me an email, and I'll make sure you get one.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I will, and thank you very much.
Yes, I get asked for my book once every few months. Max.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
So I'll make sure to get you.
Okay, thank you.
Great, that's wonderful. Anybody else? Any other questions? I think we have time for one or two more. If not, looks like not seeing any others.
I see
I think it's
Bab's iPhone waving his hand, so I guess he can't get to the, yeah, that would be me.
Okay, if you can ask, just go ahead. You can take it off mute and ask your question.
I am about to conclude my study of Lee's videos, and I've had many emotional moments while I've been learning the art of mediation, or I should say after 50 years of marriage, refining the arts of mediation. And I think what I've come to is a really nice, conclusive little mantra, which is simply, it seems that our place is to bring adversaries to the point of being allies. And if that is all we do, and then we can experience helping them to just simply feel better, which it has so many rewards. You know, I used to tell the kids when they would have tussles with each other, how capable I believed they were to settle what happened with a simple little statement. You got yourselves into it, get yourselves out. And fortunately, our family has been extremely successful in terms of staying together and being together and helping each other in all the times that that's been needed. And so I'm so grateful to Lee for the genuine nature of his enjoyment of being the mediator that he is. You can tell that, at least I can tell, that he just loves what he does. And I'm so, every time he says, well, how does this feel? How does that feel? My response, if I could have one to him, is I just feel like I'm in the best place to learn this trade as I could possibly be. And with that, I can thank someone who I started a relationship with over 50 years ago, which is a man I think is still in our meeting today, whose name is Floyd Siegel.
Well, I think that's that's high praise for Lee J, and I would echo that sentiment. I have, as far for Dan, I know he's somebody who loves what he does, and I can see it in every time I've worked with him, every time I've talked to him. I think both of these guys are just they're stellar, and they're great at what they do. And I think in the last couple of months of my time working with them on this, I know that they love what they do, and I myself have learned a lot just by talking to them, the short conversations we've had. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Everybody, I want to thank you, everybody, again.
Oh, he's saying one more thing. Sorry, one more thing.
Go ahead, DJ.
Sorry, I'm on my wife's iPad. My name is Bruce Paul.
Oh,
that's it.
Thank
you.
Go ahead, Lee J.
Oh, no, I saw him.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't see. Okay. Yeah, but I want to thank you guys. Thank you to Dan and Lee J for your time today, and I greatly appreciate it. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us. Want to remind everyone of the Employment Mediation Institute on August 5th. We will have our annual conference. SCMA's annual conference will take place on October 28th. You can find out about all of our events, and we will certainly have more events for attorneys as well. You can find the information at scmediation.org. And thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, as long as we're saying goodbye and people are hanging up, let me just toss one more thing on there, Craig. I am so impressed with the quality of the participants. I'm flipping through these screens and seeing so many amazing mediators that any of them could sit here and tell the stories that Dan and I have been telling. It's important that everybody recognize that by being on these things, we're getting better all the time. We're honing our skills. And I just love that SCMA is the hub where this happens. And I love that so many people turn out. I know a lot of our retired judges don't do this very often, but I'm sitting here on my screen looking at Frank Ochoa and Alec Williams, two of my favorites, who are two of the best mediators out there. And they are because they come to these things all the time. So I want to salute those who attend and those who want to keep learning, even though they've been doing it for decades and decades, like Floyd Siegel and all the rest.
Lee J, again, I think it and you say it.
I agree. And I also just throw it out there. We have a lot of great attorneys that I've seen today. A lot of them I recognize. I don't want to call them out because I don't know if I'm embarrassing them or not, but there's some really good, and I think I love that they are coming to this because these sort of events give, I think, better insight into mediation than probably any one of these that are just, that we might see at other places. I think SCMA takes special care in trying to make sure that attorneys get an understanding of the process and how they can benefit from it. Far more than a lot of other, I'd say, non-mediation organizations might do. It's not about winning the case. It's about resolving the dispute. And I think that, and so I want to thank them as well for coming, and hopefully we'll keep seeing everybody again. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.